A lot of people look at Africa and they see poverty. They see aid organizations, debt, and a continent that honestly just can't seem to get it together. And they assume that that is just the way things are. But here is something that they don't tell you: Africa is not poor, it is literally drained. And one of the biggest drains on this continent, one that I feel like no one really wants to put a number on, is the systematic exclusion of the very people doing the most work. African women grow between 70 and 80% of the food on this continent. They make up more than half of the self employed population, and they are the economic backbone of countless household communities and entire regions. And yet they own almost none of it. Less than 10% of land, less than 3% of startup financing. In some countries, a woman cannot even open a business account without a man's signature. Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, loses $95 billion every single year because of this. Not because of some sort of a drought or a war, but literally because of a policy, a deliberate structural policy that decides half of the continent does not get to build wealth. So if you ever sent money back home, or you watch your parents send money back home and you wonder why things don't ever seem to change, if you ever watched your aunties or your mothers or your grandmothers work their entire lives and end up with nothing to show for it legally, if you've ever been told Africa is just too broken to fix, this episode is for you. Welcome back to They Lied About Africa. I'm your host, Numba, and if nobody told you the real story, I will. In today's episode, we're talking about what patriarchy actually costs. In the last episode, we had talked about the origins of patriarchy and how it exists within Africa to this day, but we don't want to talk about it today from an emotional or social perspective. We want to look at it economically, in dollars, land, and locked out generational wealth. We're going to look at the numbers, and we're going to look at Nigeria, and we're going to look at Rwanda, which is a country that actually changed this, and what happened to their economy when they did. And we're going to ask the question I feel like not many people in your economics class have ever asked, which is, who benefits from keeping African women broke? Because here's what I know: this didn't happen by accident, and so will you'll find out in just a second. And it's not going to change until we start calling it what it is. So like I mentioned earlier, when a lot of people think about Africa, they think about poverty or they think about aid institutions. And on top of that, I feel like a lot of people talk about African poverty like it's just the way things are, like it's in the soil or something, like the continent is just behind, and that's just the story. But somebody has to count the money. And when you actually count it, and when what you find is not a continent that cannot get it together, what you find is a continent being drained. And here's what I mean. African women, like I mentioned before, grow 70 to 80% of the food on this continent. Not some of it, most of it. And they are the ones planting, they're harvesting, they're going to the market, and they're feeding their families. And they own less than 10% of the land they farm. The people doing most of the work own almost none of what they're working on. Now let's talk about what that costs. The United Nations looked at what happens to an economy when you lock women out of it. So for Sub-Saharan Africa, the number they came back with was $95 billion lost every single year. There's also an organization called the OECD, which is basically a group that tracks economic data across the world's wealthiest countries. They found that the unwritten rules of society, not like laws or customs that are put into place the way that things have always been done, those unwritten rules alone cost Africa 7.5% of its entire economy in 1 year. So think about it like this. Imagine your country earns $100 and then 7.5 of those dollars just disappear. And it's not because, like I said, of a drought or a conflict. It's because of who society decided does not get a seat at the table. And then there's business. More than half of all self-employed people in Africa are women. They are out here building and running markets and creating jobs, generating income. And they receive 3% of startup funding. 3%. McKinsey, as you may or may not know, is one of the biggest economic research firms in the world, the kind of place essentially where governments pay serious money for advice. They looked at what equal access to funding for women would actually do to African economies. The number they came back with was $300 billion in additional wealth per year. $300 billion, not from foreign aid, mind you, and from some outside intervention, but just from unlocking literally what's already there and giving these women access to things that they are prohibited from having. So this is not a small thing, as we can see. It's not an oversight, and someone built the system and someone keeps it running, and that's what the rest of this episode is going to be about. So another question is, how does this actually work? Like mechanically, what are the specific things that turn women's labor into someone else's wealth? It is 3 systems, and they all work together. The first one is land, and I want to be specific here because Africa obviously is not just one place. It's not a monolith, right? So in Tanzania, there are 3 separate legal systems operating at the same time. You have statutory law, you have Islamic law, and customary law. And the government says customary law governs inheritance, which sounds neutral until you realize that in most Tanzanian communities, customary law says land passes through the male line. So the formal legal system is essentially outsourcing discrimination to tradition and calling it cultural respect. Now in Ghana, Parliament passed laws protecting women's inheritance rights, but research found that most women in rural areas didn't even know that these laws existed, and customary practices just keep going away. In Ivory Coast, a regional study across 10 countries found that most women in Sub-Saharan Africa, regardless of their marital status, cannot own or inherit land in their own capacity, not because of the one law, but because of how statutory law and customary law stack on top of each other. And this matters beyond just it being fair, because if you want a loan from the bank, you need collateral. You need something you own. In most of Africa, that collateral is land, and no land means no loan. No loan means you are receiving no investments. So the woman who has been farming that land for 20 years cannot borrow against it. She cannot expand or build because on paper it was never hers. Now the second mechanism is financing. In Niger and Cameroon, women cannot open a bank account the same way men can right now. Not in 1960, right now. In the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, only changed this law in 2016, but before that, a woman needed her husband's written permission to sign a contract, open a bank account, or register a business. And I feel like this part should make you stop in your tracks, because it made me stop in my tracks, but that law was not some ancient African custom. It came from the Belgian colonial code. Belgium left in 1960. The DRC kept that law running for another 56 years. And even where the laws have changed, the practice hasn't fully caught up. Women across the continent are seen as higher credit risk, and they're offered smaller loans and shorter repayment windows, worse terms, and not because their businesses fail more. And if anything, the data actually shows the opposite, but because the system was not built with them in mind. And the third mechanism is one of the hardest to see because it is literally so normalized: unpaid labor. In Senegal, in Kenya, in Ethiopia, Cameroon, across the entire continent, women are responsible for cooking, healthcare, collecting water, caring for elderly relatives, and managing the household. Literally all of it. None of it enters the economy officially. It doesn't count towards GDP. It's not measured. It's not paid. But it subsidizes everything else. The formal economy runs because someone at home is doing the work that keeps the families alive. And that somebody is almost always a woman. And because she spends hours every day on that unpaid work, she has less time to build a business or study or to accumulate anything. So you have these three systems. You have land exclusion, financial exclusion, unpaid labor running at the same time in the same household on these same women. And the result is exactly what the numbers show. Now, let's go to Nigeria, because when you see how this plays out in one specific country with specific communities, court dates, laws, that's when it stops being data, and we gotta get real with it. And Nigeria has a constitution, a written one, and that constitution explicitly says you cannot discriminate against someone based on their sex. And yet, only 2% of women in Nigeria hold sole land titles. Compare that to 17% of men. So the law says one thing, the country does another. And to understand why, you have to understand that Nigeria does not run on one legal system. It runs on at least three: federal law, state law, and customary law. And for most Nigerians, especially in rural areas, customary law is the one that actually governs daily life: birth, marriage, death, inheritance. Customary law. And customary law varies by ethnic group. So let me be specific. Among the Igbo, one of the largest ethnic groups in Nigeria, daughters cannot inherit their father's land. It doesn't matter if she's the firstborn. It does not matter if she's the only child. The land passes through the male line. If there are no sons, it goes to the male relatives, uncles, cousins, the extended family, not the daughter. Among the Yoruba, daughters can inherit, but only a fraction of what sons receive. And when she gets married, she's expected to give up even that fraction, because when she joins another family, the thinking goes, she belongs to them now. Now, among the Bidi people in Edo State, female children are excluded from inheriting property entirely. She can receive personal items like clothing and jewelry, but land, housing, assets, those things go to male heirs. 3 ethnic groups you can see with 3 different systems, and they all have the same outcome. Women do not inherit. Now, here's where I think it gets interesting. In 2014, a woman named Gladys Ada Ukeji took her case all the way to Nigerian Supreme Court. Her father had died without a will, and she's being excluded from his estate under Igbo customary law. She had challenged it, and the Supreme Court ruled in her favor, said that customary law barring female children from inheriting was unconstitutional. violated the Constitution's own anti-discrimination clause. The highest court in Nigeria said this is illegal, and it still happens. Not in every family, not in every community, but wildly enough that the numbers haven't moved. Women are still being cut out of these estates and still being told that the land belongs to their brothers and still being pushed out of family homes after their husbands die. So I want you to kind of sit with that for a second. The Supreme Court said it's unconstitutional. The practice continues, which means this is not about what the law says. It's about who has the power to enforce it and who benefits from making sure it stays the way that it is. And that question, who benefits, is the most important question, I think, in this entire episode. Because if locking women out of land and capital costs Nigeria billions of dollars every single year, and the Supreme Court has already said it's illegal, and it still happens, then we have to stop calling this a cultural misunderstanding. This is a choice. And these choices also have authors. Now, I want to show you what happens when a country makes a different choice, because Rwanda did, and what happened to their economy after is something I feel like does not get talked about enough. Now, Rwanda is not a perfect country, and I want to say that up front because I think it's important to be honest when we're using a specific place as an example. Rwanda has a government that has been criticized for authoritarianism, for suppressing political opposition, for controlling the press, and that exists and it matters, right? But what Rwanda did with land reform in the early 2000s is also really cool, and the economic results are very well documented. Before 2000, Rwanda looked like a lot of what we've already described. Customary law governed land. Women were largely excluded from owning or inheriting it, and a woman's access to land depended almost entirely on her relationship with the man, her father, her husband, and her sons. The Rwanda passed the 1999 inheritance law and the 2005 organic land law, and what those laws did practically on the ground was give women equal rights to own, inherit, and register land. And it wasn't just on paper. Rwanda actually backed it up with a nationwide land registration program, and they went community by community, registered land titles, and for the first time, women's names went on those documents. And this result was not settled. Women became the majority of sole landowners in Rwanda, and a complete reversal from where they started. And then watch what happened to the economy. Productivity. Agriculture productivity went up. Household investment went up. Women who now had land used it as collateral to access credit. Exactly the mechanism that we talked about earlier. Credit they used to invest in their farms and businesses and their children's education. Rwanda became one of the fastest growing economies on the continent. Now, I'm not saying land reform did all of that alone. Rwanda's growth story is complicated and involves a lot of factors, but the connection between women's land rights and the economic output is not a theory. It's documented. Researchers have studied it, and the data is there. And here's what makes Rwanda uncomfortable for people who want to argue that this is just how African culture works, that you can't change these things, that it's too deep and old for some reason and just too embedded. Rwanda changed it in one generation, and the economy responded. So the argument that including women is too expensive or disruptive or just culturally complicated, Rwanda ran that experiment and they got the receipts back. The method Rwanda used came with real costs for some small farmers who were displaced during land consolidation, and that's a legitimate critique, and I'm not going to just ignore it. But the core finding here is that when you give women secure land rights, economies grow. And that's a solid finding. Which brings me back to the question from earlier. If Nigeria's Supreme Court already said it's unconstitutional and Rwanda already proved that changing it grows the economy, then what exactly are we waiting for? That's not a rhetorical question. That is a question your elected officials should be answering. And it's the question also I feel like us as members of the diaspora need to start asking, because we have more power in this conversation than we actually think. So let's bring this home now. We started with the number $95 billion every year, gone. And what I hope you understand now is that the number is not abstract. It has a face. It's the woman in Tanzania farming land she can't put her name on, or an entrepreneur in Nigeria who cannot open a bank account without her husband's signature, or a daughter in an Igbo household watching her father's land go to a cousin she barely knows while she gets nothing. It's your auntie, your grandmother, your mother. And if you're in the diaspora, if you're someone who grew up between two worlds, who sends money back home or thinks about going back, who carries Africa with you, even when Africa just feels so far away, this is about you too. Because here's the thing we don't talk about often, just like the many things that we talked about in this episode. When we send remittances back home, without asking where they land, we invest in communities without asking who controls the assets. When we celebrate African economic growth without asking which Africans are really growing, we can end up funding the same system we're supposed to be building alternatives to. It's not an accusation. That is a literal blind spot. And blind spots, I think, are fixable once you see them, right? Rwanda showed us that land reform works. Nigeria's own Supreme Court showed us that the law already agrees. Ghana, Tanzania, Kenya. There are women and organizations across this continent fighting these battles right now in courtrooms, in communities, and in parliaments. And part of what it means to be diaspora, part of what it means to care about this continent, beyond the aesthetics, Dirty December, pride, vibes, is paying attention to who actually holds the wealth when it has built. Because a continent that excludes half of its builders is not building. And we've been watching it leak for long enough. If this episode made you think differently about something, I want you to share it, and I want you to send it to someone who also needs to hear it. Leave a comment because I read them and I want to know what landed for you and what questions came up. And that is all I have for you today on today's episode of They Lied About Africa. I'll see you in the next episode.